About a year ago, I made a video telling everyone that it was unwise to get hyped for video games, and my reasoning behind that was that going into games with as little information as possible would yield a more positive result with all those extra surprises. The features that may have been in countless trailers, gameplay demos, and so on become more exciting, and story details will have a much bigger impact on you. I say this because that's how I entered the Deus Ex series. Deus Ex, Invisible War, Human Revolution, and now Mankind Divided. There's a certain joy of getting a game you didn't know that much about before discovering that it's really good, and that feeling is infinitely more satisfying than buying a game after watching hours worth of material. I know that people are going to want a general idea of what they are getting into, but is it really worth checking out the story trailer, which might spoil the whole premise, when reviewers can tell you how good the game is in some numerical value before and after its release anyway? I'll admit that I might hop onto the hype train on occasion, but I tend to at least steer away from it as much as I can. Hype was what arguably destroyed No Man's Sky, and I'm worried the same thing might happen to Red Dead Redemption 2. Since Mankind Divided has come out, I have played it to death and sank into what Eidos Montreal has offered us. It's reviewed well and is getting some story DLC, which is good for Deus Ex, but there's a couple of things about the game that really stood out to me. I was tempted to do a full dissection of this game in a similar way that I approached Bloodborne, but the fact is that the game is so vast and is still expanding that dissecting it piece by piece could take 6 months, not counting how many of those days will be spent working for a wage. This video is, however, an analysis of several key elements that tie back into Mankind Divided in a big way, and the impact it has had on the final product. I believe it's important to highlight each of these areas and explain in detail their impact. These areas are franchise expansion into multimedia, the rumoured corporate interference and its possible impact, the narrative as a whole, before summing up my thoughts on the game itself. Considering the spoilers I'm going to drop, including details of the late game and the ending, those who just want my thoughts on the final release might want to skip to the final section via the annotation, the link in the description, or the timecode on the screen right now. For those who are fine with spoilers, you might want to be prepared for information overload. This long video takes a look at things in and out of the game, and I am going to get very specific about them. In order to explain the multimedia problem, I'm going to have to describe the opening mission and the sequence leading into the game's first hub area. It starts with Adam Jensen travelling to Dubai with Task Force 29. The team is being sent in to break up an arms deal, but the deal heads south as a third party drops in and kills people on both sides. Adam stops them from escaping with the weapons before a sandstorm knocks over construction equipment. A brief scene with different characters takes place before Adam wakes up on a train bound for Prague. He gets off and meets a woman called Alex, revealing that not only is he working with Task Force 29, but is also working for the Juggernaut Collective, this game's version of Anonymous. After a brief walk through the station, a bomb goes off and you soon enter the world of Mankind Divided proper. There are details I have left out for the sake of time, but what matters is that there's so many questions presented to the player, despite the game acting like there shouldn't be questions in the first place. Some are forgiven, like the ones related to the secret meeting. Who are they? What is this room? What is their motivation? Because they add intrigue into the overarching plot, in addition to not involving Jensen. The questions that do present a problem vary in subject matter and what they relate to. What happened to Adam at the end of Human Revolution? Why is he part of a task force? How did he end up in this position? How long has he been with the task force? How did Adam become part of the Juggernaut Collective? Why is Adam pulling double duty between the Juggernaut Collective and Task Force 29? Who is Alex? Why does Adam talk to Alex like they've met before, even though we've never encountered her? There are a lot of other questions that boil down to the two root causes, that this game is a direct sequel to Human Revolution, down to the player character, and that the first act is missing. Except that last point isn't exactly true. Following the success of Human Revolution, Square and Eidos Montreal announced that the series would continue and expand, and would collectively be known as the Deus Ex universe going forward. One of the areas of expansion included bringing the series to the mobile market through an application and 2 separate games. The first was Deus Ex The Fall, which did okay, but is arguably more famous for the poor work put into the PC version. Much more successful was Deus Ex Go, which was a pretty decent puzzle game packed within the Deus Ex aesthetic. Of course, expanding into the mobile market can present creative and marketing possibilities, and both were put into this game, riding on the success of both Deus Ex, in addition to the previously released Lara Croft Go and Hitman Go. But what about the opportunities to expand the story, and not just use the series as window dressing? That's what Deus Ex The Fall tried by setting it before the events of Human Revolution, expanding the role of the poorly received boss fights, and introduced characters that would later make an appearance in Mankind Divided. It's not a bad way of expanding the story and lore, especially when making noble attempts to fix one of the problems with the universally despised boss fights, but economically it is an expensive route. You still need to hire a lot of people for a game like this, and then there's the costs that go into marketing and distribution. Fortunately, there are more cost-effective ways to expand the story, and can arguably present stories that wouldn't suit the structure of a video game. That's what books are for, and unlike mobile games, it isn't expensive since there has been a sustainable market for them for at least a decade. Sure, it can attract only a minority of players, but since the novelization industry is still going strong, it's hard to argue that there isn't a good amount of dedicated fans who would buy it. You see, one of the advantages of putting the series onto the page is that one of the many possibilities and scenarios that can present itself in the game can be realized. The pacing can be more controlled since the player isn't controlling the character's actions, and the writer doesn't need to worry about writing enough material to encompass an entire video game. Let's face it, even a game as short as Call of Duty Ghosts is longer than a film, and it doesn't follow traditional pacing since we as a player experience the lowest points of our journey at the beginning of the game, instead of the end of Act 2. After all, by the end of Act 2, we are comfortable with the controls, and in the case of RPGs, we are sufficiently upgraded enough to just want to keep playing comfortably. Nothing is stopping or hampering us. Books are shorter, and have the advantage of not needing to go beyond traditional narrative pacing rules. The negative effect of putting the games onto the page is that it runs the risk of turning into vital purchases. Books you need to buy and read in order to understand what is going on. Books work best when it doesn't involve the main character doing things outside the player's control, and when it's expanded on a role that might seem relatively minor. The best example of books being handled well is the Mass Effect series. Mostly. They work as a world-building tool and expands on roles and events that have been established in the 3 games. We don't need to read them in order to get the full picture, and the games are written well enough to not require their existence. The Elusive Man's background and origin story is presented in the Mass Effect Evolution comic book, but it was not a requirement to get invested in this character. You could play the games without reading it and still understand the character, his goals, and the motivations behind them. You could argue Commander Shepard being under arrest at the start of 3 felt like a jarring shift, as if it was missing a middle chapter, but those who have played the second game, regardless if you've played the Arrival DLC or not, will understand that this state was inevitable. The books truly expand, and the dedicated fans will be rewarded for investing so many hours into the expanded universe. Compare that with the bad examples, the Halo 5s of the world that are maybe too invested in their expanded universe to the point that they forgot that a vast majority of players, returning players included, will not have touched the books. I have played every Halo game and enjoyed the hell out of all of them. Hell, Halo 3 ODST is one of my favourite games of all time, and despite Halo 4's faults, I still enjoyed it a lot. I liked the universe, and I liked the characters since they have distinct personalities you can get invested in. Halo 5 changed that. It started off with a completely different protagonist in a different situation that feels so disconnected to the previous game. The main questions I had were, who is Locke, why is he suddenly a second protagonist, and why the Didact was brushed aside despite being the cause of a major incident that left hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, dead. Upon research, those answers were, number 1, Locke was the main character in Halo Nightfall who has since become a Spartan. Number 2, apparently the Arbiter wasn't good enough? I don't know. And 3, the Didact is actually dead. Yeah, remember the main villain who got away in Halo 4? He died in a comic book series. You didn't know that? Hell, I didn't until somebody pointed it out in the comment section of one of my past videos over a year ago. Back then it was hard to believe, and after seeing it myself, I still find it hard to believe. The main villain, who has been set up as a world-destroying entity that almost succeeded, is killed in a comic book by the Chief, and not by the player. A major story beat that is essential to getting the minimal amount of understanding of the game is relegated to the pages of a comic book. Which brings me back to Deus Ex Mankind Divided, because there is a comic book and a novel that takes place before the events of the game, though you only need to read Black Light to get an understanding of what is going on. It takes place 1 year after the end of Human Revolution, but well before the start of Mankind Divided. It has Adam Jensen escape from a facility run by the World Health Organization, get informed about the state of Sarif Industries, but most importantly encounters Task Force 29 because of his investigation into the looting of leftover augmentations, while also encountering Alex and Quinn from the Missing Link. By the end of the book, a member of Task Force 29 recognizes the value of Jensen, while Jensen joins the Juggernaut Collective in order to investigate the Illuminati's possible influence on Task Force 29. And considering the task force is run by Joseph Mandley from UNATCO, that will give any returning player a reason to be on the Juggernaut Collective's side. While the book itself is entertaining, if a bit too over the top at times, I found myself on more familiar terms with the introductory sequence because those previous questions I brought up are answered. The problem is, I shouldn't need to read something in a different medium just to get some basic understanding of the story. I understand that some people are going to say that the introductory sequence of Human Revolution also presents its own questions, but in the case of that game, they are answered through characterization and clever writing. Pritchard isn't a fan of Jensen because he managed to get the head of security job through his connections, and also due to the fact that he is an ex-cop.
Want to know how? Oh, wait, I forgot. Ex-cop. I doubt you'd understand.
Ex-SWAT, and you'd be surprised.
We know who he is in an instant, and his character is complex but understandable from the first minute we see him. The surprising part of this misguided approach to Blacklight's protagonist choice is that Mankind Divided not only presents interesting characters and backstories that might be suitable for novelization, but the series does know the template for creating decent expanding material. Fallen Angel details Farida Malik's past, Icarus Effect ties back into the Fall and expands on the Tyrants, even Hardline, which is included in the Collector's Edition, got the template right, because the minimal requirement is that it doesn't star the playable character, or doesn't control that character's actions. There are potential avenues to explore, since there are characters that deserve to be expanded upon, or even have a short story written about them. The incident at the end of Human Revolution only happened 2 years before Mankind Divided, so grown adults who have lived through it will have a different take on it. Aria Argento is an augmented person herself who is both a fantastic shot and has a higher neuroprosine intake requirement, which saddens her because she wants to go out into the field. It also helps that she is a very likable character, so looking at the org incident through her eyes and the rise of the mechanical apartheid system would be welcoming. Duncan McCready is a bit of a stretch due to the fact that the task force could be compromised, but his reasoning for distrusting orgs is understandable, and his backstory does deserve some expanding. Even an element of Black Light, the closure of Sarif Industries and David Sarif's reaction to it, could have presented the consequences, both financially and emotionally, of being invested in emergent technology. At the time of writing, a real-life example, Vine, has closed down despite it being ridiculously popular, so the author wouldn't have to go far to look for inspirations. Again, this is not an argument against expanding the universe through different mediums. This is an argument against creating expanded material whose consumption is required to get fully invested. As much as I enjoyed my time reading Blacklight, the fact that I had to leaves me disappointed. I am interested in expanded material for Deus Ex, but needless to say, if Adam Jensen is in it, then I will be instantly disinterested. If Square can exercise self-control over the character, then that would be good. But needless to say, after Mankind Divided, it would be easy to dismiss Square Enix as a relaxed, creative, and a company that exercises self-control. I hate rumours. I hate that they exist and that they are taken seriously enough to become a huge news story, and I hate that even when debunked, the stain it leaves behind is enough for people to use against games, companies, hardware, and sometimes developers. That being said, sometimes there is a correlation between the content of the rumours and what I am playing in front of me, to the point that it becomes hard to not take some of these rumours seriously. If you have played Mankind Divided and heard about Square's possible interference, then you will know what I am talking about. But for those who don't know, let me give you a brief outline. From looking at Mankind Divided, it is clear that to make a game of this scale and with this quality of visuals in the city of Montreal is going to take a lot of money. And it did. Production started proper after The Missing Link and presumably went full speed ahead when Eidos Montreal had finished with Thief. But needless to say, the game was going to be huge and expensive. Obviously, this made financiers a little nervous, since more money invested into the game means the game needs to sell more, which would mean more money for marketing, which would ultimately mean a lower return of investment. The solution to these worries include two critical flaws of this game. The first one is to simply cut the game into two, at what ratio we can only speculate, and use the cut portion as the starting point for the next game. The other involves Breach Mode, which was apparently a product of marketers rather than a product of developers. But Breach wasn't the solution, it was what was incorporated in it that was the second solution. A microtransaction store. It's a system I have come to expect in new games, and even so, I still sigh with disappointment when a full-priced game has the goal to place something like this within a game. What makes it even more outrageous in the case of Mankind Divided was that the store was developed in the last 2 weeks of post-production, with additional bug testing that the game could have benefited from being left until after the release. What I have said was a combination of rumours and my personal speculation, but there is evidence to support them, including Breach Mode, how fast DLC came out, the maddening Augment Your Pre-Order campaign that was cancelled last year, and the fact that review copies came without the microtransaction systems in place. There are benefits to this approach that I do want to stress. None of them are creative, but I think the viewpoint is important. Games are getting absurdly expensive and larger in file sizes, and while technology is advancing quickly, it isn't fast enough to accommodate the increased expense. The majority of popular AAA games are still being sold brick and mortar on store shelves. A publisher could go purely digital, but that isn't a viable option for a reason I will get into shortly. So they need to consider print cost and precisely how much can fit on that disc. Running at 30 FPS is mostly a hardware compromise, but the existence of lower texture resolutions in certain areas and a reduced number of animation keyframes are there to squeeze as much of the game onto the disc as possible, and that isn't even counting audio file sizes. This is why a shorter, heavily scripted game like The Last of Us and Beyond Two Souls can look better than Grand Theft Auto 5, because the latter needs to make compromises in order to fit its data on a disc. But why not release the game digitally only? Well, one reason they don't is due to the size of the game. Mankind Divided requires 45GB of free space on Steam, but in some areas of the United States, which is arguably the most lucrative market for this kind of game, a lot of restrictions ranging from download speed to caps to the fact that some areas still rely on dial-up of all things exist more prominently than in places like Europe. Even so, it doesn't get into the extra money you could or need to spend on hardware upgrades. Fact is, a disc-based console is something that is easier to sell to households than an internet-reliant PC that requires a lot of money for the initial investment. From the perspective of lower-income households. A good publisher would understand this, and I don't think Square Enix are idiots. They could have thought the same things and got worried about them from a technological and a financial point of view. But even giving them the benefit of the doubt, it feels like they elected to take an intrusive approach instead of politely sending a memo to the developers. In the end, it didn't benefit the overall quality of the game. So let's talk about Breach Mode, because it is the most glaring example of producer interference I have seen in recent memory. In brief, Breach places you in the role of an avatar whose job is to infiltrate servers, as represented by these abstract and admittedly pretty visuals, before escaping through an exit point. On paper, it's a fine idea, and it can be used to sustain a game's longevity if used right, since the gameplay in the core game is pretty solid. But it didn't work for a number of reasons. On a design level, it feels very disconnected from the main game, and I don't mean that in the sense of it taking place in a different environment at the same time. I mean in the sense that the design team didn't look at the notes for the main game. It is so disconnected, in fact, that there is a separate control scheme for Breach mode available, which is strange since the game at its core is largely unchanged from the story mode as far as mechanics go. Which leads me into the second reason why Breach mode doesn't work. When setting up a mode that is different from the base game, it is important that the same rules remain intact and largely unchanged. Sneaking past guards and killing them, taking objectives and leaving, that's fine. But the respawning guards, limited ammo that doesn't reset when you reload the level, alongside the game encouraging you to rush to the finish line, not only makes the game frustrating, but also jarring. It isn't addictive in the slightest, it breaks its own established rules, and is quite literally useless to the player who wants more Deus Ex mechanically. It's a shame too, because Breach mode could be used in a really cool way that would benefit the whole game. One of the strangest things I found out about Mankind Divided was that when I arrived at Task Force 29's secret base, I was encouraged to take a shooting tutorial. Okay, fine, nothing new about this kind of game, but this takes place about 8 hours after the start, a point where I am comfortable with the game's controls and am just yearning to go back into the field. My suggestion on how to resolve the above issues would be fairly cost effective, and would contribute to the game's world as a whole. Imagine a very small chapter of the story that's available in the main menu, like a tutorial mode, but it's set in this base. It'll function about the same as it does in the main game, with the shooting range, the places to explore, the people to talk to. You could possibly talk about the events between Human Revolution and Mankind Divided, so we can understand the situation a little more. The kicker is that there could be a virtual reality headset somewhere, or the oversized communication device Miller uses could double as a training ground under his supervision. It makes sense. In the story mode, you go into and enter the digital world that looks aesthetically the same as Breach mode, so why not turn it into a tutorial mode? After the initial session, Miller could trust Adam enough to use it unsupervised, and then Adam could use it for infiltration purposes. You'll not only resolve an early story problem, but it'll make Breach mode more fulfilling, more connected, and most importantly, more fun. It can double as a tutorial mode, and only a small amount of money would be needed, since you already have the assets you need. I'm not claiming this is the best solution, but the direction would have been better than what we got. If that doesn't work, then I wish they would have tried what Mass Effect 3 did. Its multiplayer option was mostly disconnected from the main game, but it follows the same rules, uses the exact same enemies, and even uses the same abilities. It's essentially a Mass Effect Horde mode that was fun, but more impressively, it had a minor but noticeable impact on the main plot, even if it was represented by abstract numbers. I'm not saying that neither suggestion is the be-all end-all solution, but the fact that Breach mode feels different by the way it plays means that it has already failed by the time I was done with the first set of levels, and by extension, the game lost a way to increase the game's longevity. While a lot of my previous criticisms boil down to Square Enix's plans for the series and their interference, there are things that are baked into the game by the developers that stop it from becoming a classic. One of my main criticisms of the main overarching narrative involves the final level, which showcases a lot of the major flaws in one package, but first I'll focus on the main story preceding it. If you've played Human Revolution, then the setup might sound familiar. Adam Jensen is doing his job before terrorists arrive. They cause havoc and he becomes central to the action before he takes a blow. His augments are damaged, and after getting them repaired, he is assigned a case that is seemingly unrelated to the previous incident. For Human Revolution, it was the Milwaukee Junction tutorial level, while in Mankind Divided, it is the train bombing you experienced when you first arrived in Prague. On the surface, this isn't a bad choice. It allows the antagonist's plot to portray itself as something bigger than originally thought. Unfortunately, in the case of Mankind Divided, the incident in Dubai and the train bombing are treated as completely unrelated, to the point that Miller straight up tells you that Dubai is being handled by MacReady. Granted, Human Revolution tried its damnedest to keep the lab attacks and the Milwaukee Junction attack as separate cases, but it works because they become connected no less than an hour later. Mankind Divided makes you investigate the train bombing that leads you down a fairly interesting path, but becomes fairly muddled as the reasons behind going to different locations become harder to follow. It isn't helped that there are another 2 story branches to follow, meaning that you need to follow 4 threads that the game doesn't successfully blend together. One thread is the Dubai incident that vanishes into the background until nearly 20 hours later. Another is the events surrounding the train bombing that is a little easier to follow, with the other 2 focusing on Adam's loyalty between Task Force 29 and the Juggernaut Collective. That thread is certainly interesting and could be intriguing if handled carefully, but the problem is that it, like the other threads, feel like it was crafted on its own first before taking the other threads into consideration. The story's fairly linear progression in terms of character development certainly doesn't help matters, and certain events aren't modified to reflect some major or minor choices in the long term. I wasn't expecting extra missions to be developed, but after the decision regarding Rucker's evidence and who to give it to led to little impact, I felt that this narrative thread was missing something. This isn't about Adam Jensen being conflicted between 2 different teams. This is about Adam doing his job and having a side job with a competing group. Even if there was more connectivity between the 2 sides beyond the occasional infiltration missions, by the end you'd be lucky to remember the main beats of the game. The supporting characters don't fare much better. This isn't to say that they don't have a beginning, middle, and end, but more like they have a beginning and an end, with the middle being unclear or outright missing. This is bad in terms of story structure, because Act 2 of the 3-act structure in traditional storytelling is the longest in terms of length and has the most amount of story-related information. Without it, Act 1 doesn't have anything to lead into, and Act 3 becomes void of substance and emotion. Out of all the characters you encounter, only Miller has enough substance to be interesting, because we are actively wondering if he is a member of the conspiracy, willing or unknowingly, and thus we are paying constant attention to his words, orders, and mannerisms. The 2 characters you are in constant contact with, Chicane and Alex, don't really stick out in your mind outside of their occupations. Chicane is your pilot, and Alex is your contact into the Juggernaut Collective. Their personalities and conversations don't stick out, and their backstories don't leave a lasting impact, and your actions in the game doesn't impact their behaviour towards Adam in a memorable way. There was one point that really stuck out to me. At one point you have the chance to confront the bomb maker, the task force option, or you could infiltrate the Palisade Bank to retrieve information regarding a biological weapon, the collective's option. I chose the former, and while Alex was a little miffed at first, there aren't any long-term consequences in terms of their relationship. I also chose not to give the collective vital information earlier in the game, so I was expecting that Alex would take a much more hostile, or at least distrustful attitude towards Adam. It doesn't help that the game continues and both paths will have you give Alex a sample of the biological weapon shortly after. Why don't I have the option to give that to Miller? This is an extremely dangerous weapon that's killed a major character earlier in the plot, and you would think that such an option would be available. The way the expanded universe is laid out could be partially to blame, but the story I am experiencing on the disc itself makes these conversations sound no different to Miller. Miller invites intrigue onto him, while Alex and Chicane don't stand out. Keep in mind that these characters are the 2 you will be communicating with constantly throughout the game, so for the writing to fail at having them stand out in character seems baffling to me. I have a feeling that I would be more welcoming to these characters if the constant communication roles were given to Arya and MacReady. Arya has an interesting backstory all on her own, but her conversations with Jensen are very engaging to the point where I am asking myself why this sort of character and personality wasn't wasn't one I could constantly engage in. Her story is about her wanting to get back into active duty outside of being a quartermaster, and eventually succeeding despite the massive disadvantage she possesses. The journey there could have been interesting, and used as a narrative tool to make us doubt that Task Force 29 is an Illuminati front. Of course, having a character like Arya develop throughout tens of hours might be difficult and could get stale, but some development is better than nothing. All we can do is hear that she wants to be an active combatant, have Jensen potentially give some inspiring words, and suddenly she's an agent before the final mission. We don't hear her or see her in the final mission, which is a shame because it would have been a nice payoff, but never mind about that. If Arya did take on the role as one of the two characters you're in constant communication with, then it would have been interesting if the other slot was given to the contrasting MacReady. He is one of the very first characters Jensen talks to. We start to wonder why he would hate Jensen, if it were to do with the incident, or the way people react to Jensen in comparison to him. Granted, it's the same route taken for Pritchard, but his journey from complete dickhead to mutual trust and concern allowed for brilliant character development. If you listen to Pritchard's dialogue at the beginning of the game, then listen to some at the end of the game, you can hear a difference in character.
Pritchard, I'm in.
Nicely done, Jensen. May I ask how?
A vent on the roof. It'll be in my report next time we discuss security loopholes.
Oh, goody. I'll be sure to take notes.
Pritchard, the lockdown's disengaged. I'm heading back to the hangar to see if those blast doors are open. Have you been able to raise anyone?
I'm picking up several glimmers, but there's too much interference. I think you're on your own, Jensen.
Careful there, Francis. You almost sound like you regret that.
From the sound of MacReady, it seems like the same thing was attempted here, but like Arya, there wasn't any development in the middle the player can experience. You can find it, but a story and character like this feels like something that should be experienced throughout the main quest and not sought out. It is another missed opportunity. Speaking of missed opportunities, I feel like the overall theme is lacking in substance. If you've paid some attention to Mankind Divided's marketing, then you will be familiar with the racial theme it wants to explore. The main marketing hook was being in a mechanical apartheid, from the backstory to the environments to the name of the game itself. It is something that is impossible to miss. Admittedly, this was something I was excited for, and in the end, it doesn't really do much with it. Not to say that it does nothing, I like the attitudes people have for augmented civilians, but in the end, the only mechanical elements that represents the theme well is the train ride. The augmented civilians, including Adam, are separated from the rest of society. They have their own train carriages, waiting lines, and if you step out of line, you're going to get a quick visit from the police. Unfortunately, that's just about all it does with the theme, and when you encounter the guards at the train station's exit, you only need to go through them once, and they won't bother you again. There was another opportunity with the theme in the latter part of the game, but the game kinda shoots itself in the foot with this cutscene.
Don't know why he didn't listen. Let's see what we have. Fuck! Then why did he run?
What's the holdup? So?
So we killed a citizen.
The city's on lockdown. A true citizen would respect that. Get him in the truck.
It doesn't really reinforce the theme as much as it acknowledges that the police are complete dicks in general. A better way to address the theme is if the curfew in the latter part of the game was restricted to augmented civilians only. The naturals could continue on with their lives, and since this section takes place late at night, you have an excuse to not have as many NPCs on the street. It could also add an element of challenge. Civilians who spot you could immediately go to the nearest policeman. It would work thematically since the incident, alongside the propaganda present in the city, would fully characterize the civilians as a scared population who want to stay safe. Adam would experience the consequences of human revolution more through mechanics and not through acknowledgement. And finally, we come to the final level, the climax of the entire journey, and credit where credit is due. I thought it was handled better than Human Revolution. The level design is solid, it is fun, it is tense, and Viktor Machenko works well as a boss. You know this man as a character, there are several ways you can take him on that works within the story, and if you take him on, then the game turns into an examination. He's a much more believable villain than the tyrants and Zhao, but like those boss fights, the biggest weakness lies in the story. The reason you are there is to stop the Illuminati from manipulating the legal system, by poisoning one of the Augmented's most prominent advocates and framing it on them. The story isn't really conveyed that clearly, but the confusing duality of the cases finally meet at this point, but with little payoff. It's clear that the writers had to scramble to make the story have some semblance of sense by packing the needed resolutions into this chapter. McCready sounds like his arc is completed, even though he hasn't been active to the plots for the entire game. A major character in the conspiracy shows up and we are supposed to know this guy, but outside of names, I don't know what to make of him. Hugh Darrow avoided this path entirely by having limited but significant appearances in Human Revolution, and Nathaniel Brown has complexities that make him slightly interesting. He is against the Human Restoration Act, which would further segregate augmented humans, and he is the man behind the cities that would allow augmented people to live in peace. But he is also the CEO of the company behind what is now Golem City, the hellhole where unregistered augmented civilians in Prague go to die. A more personal presence would amplify his importance and would make him a more memorable character, but without that, we have maybe an hour or two tops to get to actively know him. This wouldn't be so bad if Machenko was the focus of the whole operation, but he isn't. He's certainly in it, but with the focus on Brown being so prominent to the point that he is the first person you meet when you arrive in London, it feels like his inclusion is, once again, part of the scrambling. However, despite that weak narrative framework, despite the holes caused by producer interference and what is deliberately baked into the game, despite everything I have just said that could come across as me wanting to bury this game, Deus Ex Mankind Divided is one of the best games of the year. I know it's a bit of a U-turn for me to say that Mankind Divided is one of the best games of the year. I've spent the last god knows amount of minutes criticising the hell out of the main narrative, but that's really one of two major criticisms I have for the game. It's a mess with its structure, payoff, and content both on and off the disc, but narrative is only one of three key elements to a video game. If one element, in this case the narrative, fails to hold up, then the other two elements, visuals and gameplay, need to perform well for a game to at least be considered okay. I've criticised the narrative because the other two elements perform so well that it has managed to not only keep the game standing, but also make it excellent. Also, while the main narrative fails to live up to the potential the overall theme has, the side quests handle it a lot better. It asks questions on the unintended consequences of segregation and the measures put in place due to justifiable paranoia. This isn't a Nazi Germany or a South Africa situation where the isolated humans had little to no justification of being sent to ghettos. This is the impact of a worldwide event where the perpetrators were, in the eyes of the public, exclusively augmented humans. Sure, Darrow had a role to play, but he created the technology, so he is synonymous with his creation regardless. It would make sense for augmented humans to be cordoned off into the best viable space for them. Would you want to live next door to an augmented human who could potentially go completely psychotic at any moment? The side quests inject situations that are both grounded and bizarre enough for them to become believable stories, and since their short length means that they have little to no interference from Square Enix, that means the sheer brilliance of the writing shines, the events are memorable, and the beats of the individual stories and chapters allow us as an audience to vividly remember them. Pro tip, if you get this game, and I highly recommend you do, complete as many side quests as possible before progressing with the main plot. You will have a very fun time. Though, while the main story from its structure to its character development is a complete mess, there are flashes of brilliance that are hard not to admire in isolation. The way the world building is handled in general means that we can get the idea of what kind of place we are in just by glance. It is clear that the narrative team and the art team collaborated closely, and took into consideration what this kind of world would look like. I could spend hours just standing in individual areas, overly analysing something and not get bored, and that isn't even mentioning the small details the main narrative does get right, even if there are very few of them. The main villain was handled nicely in terms of his characterization and number of appearances. I thought the mystique of Janus was pretty good, and the first time you enter Adam's safe house has got to be one of my favourite parts of the entire game. It's a small and very minor part to compliment, but when a short 10-minute sequence manages to get something as mundane as a character taking a shower and opening the blinds to be entertaining with a serious note, it's something worth praising. However, the quality of the gameplay is the most important part of a game to me. You can have a weak story with great visuals and gameplay, you can have the best story in the world with amazing gameplay, but I feel that a game that prioritizes visuals and narrative over the one unique aspect of the medium has a hard time succeeding, unless you have a big brand name behind it. It has succeeded before in terms of public and press reception, but for every The Last of Us and The Wolf Among Us, there are about 1,000 The Order 1886s. I went into this game expecting something mechanically sound, and that's what I got, though that might be more down to the level design more than any other factor. Mankind Divided was an opportunity to polish what Human Revolution got right, and make amends to what didn't work previously, while also adding in enough to justify a sequel. The UI and upgrade screen is a lot easier to handle, though the quick select menu is a lot to be desired, and I liked the fact that they weren't afraid to remove the most useless upgrade from the last game. Of course, there is also the sequel problem of adding in gameplay while also having it make sense to the story. Executing this in Deus Ex isn't as simple as slapping an add-on to the list of tricks Adam Jensen already has, and you're done. Adam Jensen has a unique character description that the writers and designers likely didn't anticipate using in a sequel. He isn't Samus Aran, where the upgrades and additional mechanics are simply an extension to a tool the character uses. The tool is Adam, and his adjustments served as the basis of the Milwaukee Junction level. So you have a very unique problem, but they somehow managed to incorporate more gameplay mechanics into the game while having it make sense story-wise. They actually become the trigger to a major side quest that lasts throughout most of the game. These upgrades are quite useful, but I found that what you use is largely down to what playstyle you are going for. Whereas Human Revolution's upgrades sans the Typhoon can be used regardless of your playstyle, Mankind Divided's new additions seem a bit more binary. Sure, they can be used in different playstyles, but come on, you wouldn't use the Titan upgrade unless you were going to go full Rambo on everyone in the room. There isn't much else to talk about on the gameplay front. It's essentially Deus Ex Human Revolution, but with a bit more polish and some more upgrades. While that can be seen as a minor improvement, what is a major improvement is the level design. Human Revolution had pretty decent level design, but Mankind Divided's vertically oriented approach to architecture meant that the individual areas turn into elaborate, but believable mazes. They managed to make Prague work as both a hub city and an entire level, and because of that, you're probably going to find yourself spending hours exploring and just seeing the sheer attention to detail I just put into this area. This game has been in development since The Missing Link came out, maybe even before its release, and I wouldn't be surprised if the level designers made the levels first and added the story elements later. It helps that the entire game is just amazing to look at. Sure, the lip syncing is as dodgy as ever, but the fact that what I am looking at is possibly one of, if not the best looking game of the year, allows me to forgive that fairly major issue. The game understands that a memorable level takes into account the colour scheme. Sadly, this does mean that the orange tint from Human Revolution is gone, but consider this, it's cyberpunk taking place in the daytime, which itself is pretty weird, so would an ever-present tint give it more or less of an identity? I like the fact that each area and location is memorable through colour, so we as a player can reflect on our experience with copious detail. In fact, my biggest criticism, the one that trumps even the main narrative, is something incredibly specific. I wanted more Gollum City. Just look at this place. It's a complete joy to go through. It taps into the strange fantasy of being inside the Kowloon walled city, turned up to dystopic levels. I loved that its economy was taken into account. I love the oppressive nature of the environment itself. I love the dire tone it evokes throughout, and I love that you spend 10 to 30 minutes just climbing the city alone and nothing goes wrong. That actually taps into something that could be used as an example for aspiring indie developers. If you want to make a walking simulator, use this game as a reference. I think I spent most of my playtime just walking around without taking advantage of the environments. It manages to pace the story sections just right that the sheer act of walking is, in itself, entertaining. It helps that it sounds amazing, and seriously, this soundtrack, it's no wonder they brought Michael McCann back. He's someone who manages to evoke the emotion needed to buy into this game. Just listen to it. So if I were judging the game by that, then it would have been an easy game of the year. In some ways, I was anticipating it when I finally got my hands on it. But a narrative that is trying to balance its expanded universe and Square Enix's possible interference bogs it down. It's hard to really give this game a gold sticker with full confidence, because the main quest is so objectively broken that I feel angry that it was brushed aside to get work on the next installment done. Breach didn't need to be there, the micropayments didn't need to be there, and I feel so sorry for Eidos Montreal that they had to put up with those publisher expectations. If they had another year, then the game would have been a classic, but by cutting it up into two, it is, by extension, setting a horrible example for publishers and consumers. If Square's intention for doing that was to drive interest of the next installment, then what can I say? They succeeded. But not because of Square's direct involvement with the content on the disc, it is because of the valiant efforts of Eidos Montreal to fix their mistakes and improve upon what was an excellent game, but now broken into pieces. I could have just condemned the practice and say it won't ever work, but I would only be blanking out by far the most powerful thoughts I had by the time the credits rolled. I wanted more of this game yesterday.